Hey everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. So today I want to talk about the ETH Bitcoin valuation and what it might tell us about where the market is heading next. If you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like and follow us on Twitter, but a lot of updates about indicators and more over there. So the ETH Bitcoin valuation is a metric a lot of people watch, and basically all it is you take the price of Ethereum, divide it by the price of Bitcoin. So it's basically telling you how many Bitcoin is one ETH worth. And so, basically because the price of ETH is lower than the price of Bitcoin, it's in a decimal, it's going to be worth a fraction of Bitcoin. And so with Ethereum, when it first came into existence, it really exploded against Bitcoin. But really ever since then, it's been more or less kind of range bound, just going sideways ever since. And, one of the ways that people often will look at these valuation charts is they'll say, is it an uptrend or a downtrend? If something is trending up against Bitcoin, that often will mean that it's, potentially a better performer than Bitcoin. If it's trending down, it's a worse performer. So here we can actually see that across, time, Bitcoin, after this big run up through 2017, has actually been kind of performing at relatively equal to Bitcoin from this perspective. But there's another way of looking at this chart that I think is maybe a little bit more interesting about telling us where the market might head next. And that's really telling us about, what it can tell us about the market cycle or where we are, if we're in a bullish or a bearish phase. So I think that to look at this is useful just to put it up against the total crypto market cap. So that's what I have here. So on the top is the ETH Bitcoin valuation. The bottom is the total crypto market cap. And one of the things that you'll notice when you look at this is that generally speaking, when the ETH Bitcoin valuation is an uptrend, generally speaking, that also corresponds to the market being in an uptrend. And likewise, when the ETH Bitcoin valuation is in a downtrend, that tends to coincide with periods where the market is maybe more bearish. And so the same, played out through here, and then even the same would have played out coming off of these highs in November. You can see the ETH Bitcoin valuation started going to a downtrend here in December. We were in a downtrend in the crypto market over there as well. And so in some ways this makes sense, because what it basically means is that Ethereum, which has tended to be, the smaller market cap asset between Bitcoin and Ethereum, during bull markets, the more risky asset, which has tended to be ETH, outperforms Bitcoin, but then in bearish times, Bitcoin outperforms ETH. And so that's why this shows up. So when the market's in a bull market, more risky assets tend to do really well. They tend to outperform higher market cap assets. So, ETH outperforming Bitcoin. Then in bearish times, it tends to be the larger market cap assets, like for example, Bitcoin, that outperform the smaller cap, lower or higher risk assets, which historically speaking, ETH has been that relative to Bitcoin. And so that's one way that you can kind of look at this to give us an idea of where we might stand. Now, obviously, the size of these kind of moves has been shifting because, the market cap of ETH has been getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's kind of catching up to Bitcoin to some extent. And so there's maybe a little bit less volatility in its relative valuation as there was in the past. But still, this idea of an uptrend versus a downtrend, I think is interesting. And so what's been going on more recently, if we just flip back to the ETH Bitcoin valuation chart, is that we can see that recently we basically were in kind of this downtrend from December, really fell off a cliff over here going into the lows in June, but then we had this really steep rally coming off the hype of the merge, right? And then that just happened, and now we're actually plunging back down. The price of ETH has been moving down to a greater extent than Bitcoin's price has been moving down, so therefore the ETH Bitcoin valuation has been plummeting down. And what I think what this might kind of be useful to look at, or what information this might be telling us, is that if this keeps falling off a cliff, that could actually spell out more risk for the crypto asset generally. Now, of course, some could argue that this is all just kind of artificial because of the merge hype. But, the merge was kind of this bullish catalyst for the crypto space generally, maybe. And if the merge couldn't kind of get the market back on track, then what will? And so in some ways, you might say that even though it is kind of an artificial event, the fact that this can't continue up after it might mean that the market's not ready to reestablish a bullish footing. And so if we keep falling down and really kind of reestablish this downtrend, set in a newer low below the June lows, that would be suggest potentially that the bear market is not done yet. And so obviously right now it's hard to know if we're going to set a new low. So what I want to talk about next is actually some things I was playing around with by applying some of our models that we have here on the channel to the ETH Bitcoin valuation. So that's what I'm showing you here. So if you're familiar with our upside downside potential indicator, it's our risk model here at the channel. And generally speaking, we talk about this for charts that are an asset versus the US dollar. So for example, the ETH USD chart, that's usually what we're applying the UDPI for. But what's nice about the UDPI is a general purpose model. It's something that can be applied to many different things, a bunch of different crypto assets on the US or the asset USD charts, but also we can apply it to relative value charts like the ETH Bitcoin valuation chart. And so that's what I'm showing you here. And you can see that across time, it does a really good job identifying these high points. It's kind of high risk points where buying ETH versus Bitcoin has not been a very good deal, but also these low points where acquiring ETH versus Bitcoin has been a pretty good deal, so on and so forth. That's basically the way that I would interpret this. And so you see that, in this run up that we had in the spring of 21, when ETH really ran way ahead of Bitcoin and its valuation relative to Bitcoin really exploded, we got up into this high risk zone again. And now we've been kind of chopping along more sideways. And we can see this a bit more clearly. We just look at the raw output across time. So again, yellow line is the ETH Bitcoin valuation across time. White line is the UDPI level. And so you can see, ETH really had this big run against Bitcoin back here in the spring of 21. We got all the way up to actually 5, maxing out the top of the UDPI there. And then we've been kind of just going sideways ever since. This kind of slight uptrend, but really not putting in any meaningful upside against Bitcoin in this time. And then this downtrend. Now, what's notable is we actually spiked up to almost 2 in this run going up in the merge, which is, again, the highest level we've seen since, back here. And really, we have to go all the way back to this bear market kind of rally that ETH did against Bitcoin back here going into the middle of 2018 to get back to a point where we got to a similar UDPI level. And so one way of interpreting that is, is this kind of a stretched out version of this, right? Where we get this big run of ETH versus Bitcoin, we go up to this highest level of UDPI here. And then, instead of putting in that big move, kind of that bigger move on the UDPI immediately, we kind of waited a little bit later. But then, of course, we saw this big downtrend then continue with ETH versus Bitcoin later. Could this be coming next? And, it's also notable that technically ever since, not even the all-time high, ever since kind of the intermediate run that ETH put in, it was actually in a big downtrend all the way through here. Maybe you could argue the same is happening through here, even though it put in a higher high right over here. So, one way that we can look at this is that this is a bearish indication, right? That if we got overextended, especially during a bear market, like what we saw back here, maybe that means then there's going to be a big flush out and that ETH is going to actually fall pretty substantially against Bitcoin in the coming, months to year or longer. And that could then mean that the rest of the crypto market would be falling off a cliff as well, because that, of course, happened through here, that we had a massive drawdown in the broader crypto market as this played out. But then again, in 2019, we actually ended up having a rally for at least Bitcoin in here, where, ETH didn't rally to the same degree down through here. But in the shorter term, it would mean more downside if that were to play out. So that's one possibility, right? And the fact that we're getting rejected to the downside makes that a possibility that we can't necessarily ignore. And if we just look at the raw level of the UDPI, there's plenty more downside that I think is possible. I should mention this is the medium term that I'm showing you here, so I'm just kind of showing you the one that's kind of in the middle. This cares about moves that play out over weeks to multiple weeks. But the long term looks similar, where it spikes up at these different levels, and we also got more overextended here than some of these other levels. So that could be a potential bearish outlook, right? That we got overextended kind of in the short term, or the more medium term for the ETHBTC valuation, and maybe then more pain needs to follow. But there are other models we can look at. So another model that I had fun applying to the ETH Bitcoin valuation was the momentum bias indicator, or MBI. So again, we usually show this indicator with the whatever asset, for example, ETH USD chart, but it also works for these relative value charts. So again, yellow line here is the ETH Bitcoin valuation across time. And then, this line here that alternates between green and red is the MBI level across time. So if you're not familiar, the MBI tracks momentum. So basically momentum bias, is the momentum bias to the upside, really kind of pulling price, or in this case, the ETH Bitcoin valuation up, or to the downside, which can then often lead to these big drawdowns, these negative momentum regimes that kind of really pull price down. So what's interesting about looking at this is that, really up until more recently, we hadn't really entered into a bear market type of behavior. So you can see that a bear market, kind of the biggest bear market in the ETH Bitcoin valuation is obviously this one going down through here. And the NBI behaves like it always behaves in a bear market for whatever asset you're looking at, spends a heck of a lot more time in the red than in the green. And when it does get up to the green, it kind of pokes its head above zero, kind of gets rejected, goes back into the deep green, and then kind of does this oscillation around zero in a transition between bearish phase and bull phase, and then you get this big explosion upwards. And so we saw kind of the beginning of this bear market start to unfold here, right? We started going down, popped our head above zero, came down, get rejected more deeply into the red. But then the merge run, popped us up into the green and actually spent a decent amount of time up here until now we're starting to fall off a cliff down towards the negative territory. And so this is where I think, we're kind of at a critical level on the NBI's perspective between a bullish or a bearish outlook, right? If we can actually catch ourselves pretty quickly here and kind of revert back up and maybe even start to do this oscillation around zero like we saw before back here coming out of a bear market, then that might actually mean that we might be kind of getting into this accumulation zone that might portend or precede a more bullish run, which then by proxy might mean a more of a bullish run for the rest of the market. Because again, when ETH runs against Bitcoin, that tends to be in bull markets. When it bleeds against Bitcoin, that tends to be bear markets. So if this were to start this oscillation around zero to lead to a big shoot off to the upside, that would actually be a bullish outlook for the market. If instead we just fall deep into the red or even set in a new low down here, start really just falling off a cliff down here, that would be quite bearish indeed. And so the way that I would kind of, I'm interpreting these two different indicators against each other is I think the UDPI is saying that a bearish outlook is very plausible right here. We've gotten rejected off of this relative overextension like we've seen in previous kind of bear markets for the Bitcoin valuation. And so continued downside into some of this deeper territory, maybe even all the way down to some of these levels that we haven't seen for a very long time, even during this bear market yet. We haven't seen levels down here yet. They might come more into play. But the NBI thinks that that could happen as well, but it also thinks that there's this other possibility, right? So the NBI hasn't really made up its mind yet in that extent. Basically, it's saying that we haven't really re-entered this clearly bearish negative momentum bias regime yet. And so there could be some hope that, these risk levels might not actually come into play. So something that I'm going to be watching very closely. And we just think about it more on kind of a technical level, just kind of on a technical analysis perspective. What you might look for is, do we set a lower low, or are we able to hold? Or especially, are we able to hold kind of within this range that we have started to set back here, going all the way into March of this year, right? This kind of trend line that we've been on. We have just kind of broken it for a second time to the downside just today. But then, can we hold some of these higher levels as support, or do we really have to go and set in a new low? And if we set in a new low, that would be, especially bearish. And frankly, by the time we got there, I think the market would have already shown us that we're entering into the next leg down. So really what you'd like to see is this be able to catch a bottom sometime not too far from here, potentially. Because if we can't, and if we keep just plummeting to the downside, that might mean that we're already too far gone and that the rest of the market is going to fall to its next leg down. So a potential, canary in the coal mine here, something that I'm certainly going to be watching closely. Not financial advice, obviously, but that's what I'm seeing in the data. All right, if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter. Put a lot of updates, better indicators, and more over there.